So the way that this session will work is that we'll have each of the speakers give 10 minutes on their particular habitat that they were working on, and then all of the questions, we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So it's a little bit different to the other thematic sessions that you may have attended, but please do ask questions throughout the talk so that we can collate them together and ask the speakers at the end. So we'll be monitoring those. So without further ado, I think it's time for me to pass over to David Coomes, who's going to talk to you about UK woodlands as nature-based solutions to climate change and biodiversity challenges. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can see your screen and hear you.
Brilliant. Okay, so I was leading the team of people working on woodland nature-based solutions in this UK context. And there was actually a large number of people involved, coming from very different perspectives, and we also had some very helpful advice from reviewers as well. And so I think woodlands are a really exciting prospect for nature-based solutions in the UK because they offer us the opportunity, as never before, to help contribute towards solving the climate crisis in the UK context, and also the biodiversity crisis. And we have a sort of growing appetite of government to expand woodland cover. And I think this goes back particularly a decade to Sir David Reed's report with others on combating climate change, where they wrote a very strong and powerful report calling for an increase in woodland cover, pointing out that we're one of the least forested wooded countries in Europe, 12%, I think it's an average of 35%. And so there's opportunities to increase wood cover to sort of mitigate climate change. And they made a very, and then more recently we've had Michael Gove and government recognising in the 25-year plan to improve the environment that the importance of nature, nature-based solutions as a key part of this delivery of improving the environment. And Zach Goldsmith in government is a very outspoken advocate of expanding woodland cover, but also not just to solve the climate crisis, but to deliver multiple solutions. But it is controversial about particularly where we're going to put the woodlands, what type of woodlands we're going to plant. And so I wanted to just go through briefly some aspects of this and some trade-offs. So we've got firstly, what is the carbon mitigation potential of woodlands? And the answer is that it's quite complicated to work out. At the moment, they're storing about 4 billion tonnes of equivalent carbon dioxide per year in total, and the sequestration of those woodlands is about 4.6% of the total emissions of the country. So in some ways that's a small number, but as I'll show you in the next slide, there's opportunities to make that a more significant number as we decarbonise our economy. So the second point is that the National Statistics Office has calculated that the capital value of non-market benefits of woodlands about 12 times the benefits of wood production. That's a remarkable statistic. So it's saying that by these calculations, particularly carbon storage in woodlands and sequestration greatly outweigh the value of the timber industry in our country. So there's opportunities to manage our woodlands differently in the future if we can find incentives for protecting the carbon and indeed increasing the carbon sequestration in future. And so these government objectives to plant about 30,000 extra hectares of woodland per year from about 2025 really offer significant opportunities to mitigate climate change through carbon drawdown. Although if we're planting woodlands, that's going to be a slow and steady increase in mitigation potential over time. It's not going to be an instant effect. So here we have an illustration of what we might expect. At the moment, carbon the carbon sink in woodlands is about 4.6% of total emissions. But over time, as we decarbonise, and we absolutely have to do that as a key priority, what we'll find by 2050 is there will be elements of industry which we cannot decarbonise, and by planting more trees, we can offset some of those emissions. That's the hope from a carbon perspective. And as I say, it's actually really hard to get hold of the numbers supporting this. The Reid report is perhaps the best available evidence on what we can achieve with this from 10 years ago. Okay, what's the biodiversity values of different strategies which we might employ in the future? So the first thing which the Independent Committee on Climate Change has been recommending is actually that we bring our native woodlands back into active management. We've got 42,000 tiny fragments of old woodland, ancient woodland, and much more secondary broadleaf woodland, and it's been largely abandoned for a long time in terms of the economy. And the Committee on Climate Change has recommended we start managing these again and use the wood for timber and for fuel wood, thereby offsetting fossil fuel use, which is an abatement principle that we can use that wood instead of fossil fuels. Now, bringing back woodlands like this beautiful bluebell woodland into active management could, in a limited sense, be good for biodiversity. We know that restoring coppicing and taking out some of the big trees in densely packed woodlands actually is beneficial to these ground flora and other ground living organisms. But if we take out these veteran trees, these old trees, in too large numbers, we're really going to have a very destructive effect on biodiversity. And also, if we take out the deadwood from these forests, these woodlands accumulate biodiversity over time, and these beautiful old veteran trees, much loved by the public, they are immensely valuable for biodiversity. So we've got to be super careful if we're going to actively manage our native woodlands again, that we don't do more damage than good. We've got to keep hold of those old trees and deadwood across our landscapes, and we know from the National Forest Inventory that they're sorely lacking in many of our woodlands. The second one, which we can do, is expand native woodland cover, and this offers opportunities to build bigger, better, joined up nature. That's the sort of Lawton Review recommendations of what we do. We can allow new woodlands, native woodlands, to sort of recolonize parts of the landscape and connect up our ancient woodlands and old secondary woodlands. And they will gradually accumulate biodiversity over time and actually form an important means of migration during climate change. These native woodlands can actually be better at sequestering carbon than exotic plantations. That's a really interesting point, not often recognized. They don't produce as much timber though. And for nature conservation, we really think that we should be looking more at natural establishment and natural regeneration, rather than just always thinking about planting. At least we should put that on the table as something to consider more often. But we must avoid planting these woodlands in open habitats, which are priorities for conservation. There's been mistakes planting woodlands into species-rich grasslands, for example, in the past. We must avoid that. The third option is to expand our cover of conifer plantations, and that will provide us with more timber, which we're in short supply in the nation. We import lots of timber and provide jobs. There's a long history of looking at whether conifer plantations are damaging for biodiversity or not, and there's many papers on this subject. But I think it's fair to say that they can have a negative impact on biodiversity depending on how they're managed. But spatial planning can actually reduce those impacts, and the UK Forestry Standard is providing a mechanism by which those impacts can be reduced. Okay, trade-offs. The first trade-off to think about in my remaining few moments is to think about where on earth to plant all these trees. If we had 30,000 hectares to plant a year, that's quite a lot of trees. Where are we going to put them? And so we've got some difficult choices here. So I've ranked these in terms of the sort of productivity of the land. Grade 1, 2 or 3A agricultural land. These are areas which are great for crop production, and they're valuable land as well because they can be used for crop production. If we plant woodlands on those, they'll grow fast, but we're actually taking cropland out of production. And unless we somehow miraculously increase yields, what we'll have to do is import more food and have a knock-on effect on habitats overseas, perhaps causing the clearance of tropical forests to meet our food demands. So that's not a great plan, although some planting of woodlands around the edges of fields and close to urban areas would be highly recommended because they benefit people in towns in terms of providing recreational opportunities. The second opportunity would be to plant in sort of poor grasslands, which are currently used for meat production primarily, and these lands are cheaper. And the third option is to plant on extensive peatlands, but if we do that, then we might not have much benefit for carbon sequestration because disturbing the peat releases CO2 into the atmosphere. But that is the cheapest option. We recommend that the majority of the planting should be on these low productive grasslands because they offer the best opportunities for us. But if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that they aren't priority habitats for other organisms, and we've got to eat less meat in order to deliver any climate benefits. Otherwise, we're just sending the problem overseas again. And the what to plant. Native species or conifers, well, that's a difficult one because we're actually trying to trade off three things: carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and timber production. And we've got to decide in the UK where we're going to put our priorities. But I certainly think, in conclusion, that we should be emphasising as the British Ecological Society that we can establish much more native woodland in places with in place of species poor grassland, and some planting near towns, and that will offer opportunities to sequester carbon, restore woodland biodiversity, and deliver other benefits. But in order to do that, we've got to eat less meat. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think you've given us a lot to think about there, and I can see several excellent questions coming in already, which of course we'll ask at the end.